We are reading 5 or 6 verses in Luke, which is quite interesting and tells us a lot about Jesus, believe it or not. It's strange, isn't it? So I am reading about the man with leprosy from Luke 5, verses 12 to 16. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell on his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him. Then Jesus ordered him, "Don't tell anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Yet the news about him spread all around, so the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of the sickness. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Okay, let's kind of look at a few of the words that Jesus uses here. First thing that happened, which was out of context, of course, was that Jesus touched this leper. Now, the lepers were kind of sent all everywhere. They weren't allowed to go anywhere. They were outside the town. And goodness me, you didn't touch one. That was, the culture was absolutely out of order. So Jesus was out of order by touching him. And that the first thought was that Jesus's act was an act of commitment, a commitment to touch what wasn't allowed. Now, because he couldn't be touched, obviously their attitude, the leper was one who was feeling excluded, and his kind of personal attitude would be just of worthlessness. So Jesus's touch meant more than just a touch. It was a commitment which he had probably never had before. Suddenly, something had happened. This man who was a healer, out of context, instead of kind of being far away and making a prayer from a distance, he touched him. Maybe it was on his shoulder. And it's like us here. And I've met a number of people through lockdown, and I've chatted to them, and etc., etc. And suddenly there's a warmth suddenly appears, because sometimes in the coffee shop you chat to people and they're kind of terribly lonely, and you're kind of talking about reading a book. So I just start chatting about the book, and suddenly there's a kind of there's a light comes on, and something happens. And I think this is Jesus's commitment is something that we ought to do to people who are outside. A touch, a hand on the shoulder. Sometimes it's appropriate for a hug, to show a connection with the person. What we're doing, we're linking the spirit of Jesus, and kind of, even with a hand, we might be just giving so much encouragement to someone that we don't know. There was one person last week that told me, I thought I only met her 2 weeks ago, and I only chatted to her 2 or 3 times. And she said to me, "Do you know," she said, "you lit my day up," she said, "by talking to me and accepting me and laughing with me and enjoying company with me." So I think, oh, really? Well, there you go, And I think sometimes our attitude doesn't realize that, but people need this. So that's my number 1 point. Number 2 point is that it says that the man reached out. The man said, when he asked him, "Are you willing to heal me?" And Jesus said, the answer was immediate and positive. Yes, I am. And be clean. Absolutely positive. And number 3, they're very, very interesting. This is the interesting point, that we talk about Jesus's view when he said, don't tell anyone. What a stupid thing to say. I mean, he just healed. Look at this. It's just quite amazing. So just look at that for a moment. You see, now Jesus, I'm going to read another passage. Jesus had just sent the 72 out to villages where they're in twos. They went and they prayed for people and they saw lots of results. So just let me read this little bit to you. It's Luke 9, 10 to 11. So that these 72 had returned, and then Jesus said, when they returned and they reported to Jesus what they had done, and that there had been so many healings and things that they'd done. Very interesting. He took them and withdrew by himself with them. So he wanted to be with them and just pray with them, open them up and talk to them. But what actually happened next, he says, right, that he withdrew with them, and he went to a town called Bethsaida so he could talk to them individually. But the crowds learned about this and followed him. And he welcomed them, and this was the feeding of the 5,000. So Jesus wanted to take the disciples away so he could teach them and talk to them and implant the gospel, implant his ways. But the crowd came, so he didn't kind of. His next move was to say, "Okay, the crowds come. Okay, the feeding of the 5,000. I'm going to teach them." So Jesus taught them, and he did the feeding of the 5,000. And then what did he do next then? At the end of that period of time, what he did was he sent the people away. He sent the disciples across the lake, and he went up into the hills to be with his Father. It was constant with Jesus, and absolutely fundamental that he spent time with his Father all the time. He was always going off, either with the disciples on their own, if he could possibly do it, and then only then perhaps he'd be ready to do the miracles and things, because he'd been with his Father and stimulated by him, and that type of thing. Very interesting that that was the case. Now, it is interesting because Jesus withdrew so he could be with them, and the crowds came to Jesus, and that was what was happening. Now, the interesting thing is that often our attitude to miracles is, goodness me, we must go and tell people. We must go and tell them. I saw this fantastic, we're down at church, we had this, that's very fantastic. And Jesus is saying, you don't have to do that. You really don't have to share that in that manner, because if you're not careful, all you're doing is actually bringing these things up so high in the level of kind of acceptance that the miracles are more important than the lifestyle. That's what he's saying. So he's telling us, I think, to be careful. Don't just fling it around. It's a miracle, as an absolute miracle last week. Did you see that? There's a way of doing it, I think. He's not saying don't ever say anything, but the context is what we can do is to kind of virtually talk about the miracle, but actually the whole essence is that something has happened from God that actually changes us. And in a miracle, it changes us. And what Jesus is all the time saying, I want your character changed. I want your attitude, your personality. I want it changed so you think like I do. You come to me in the same way as Jesus comes to the Father. That's what he's saying. So out of that, it's quite interesting because I just was thinking of how do I respond to this? Because I like to share things, and many times I've shared things at the front of the church, and I haven't done it for 2 years hardly because I'm never there. So, and of course I get something to share, and I'm standing there kind of waiting to share, and I share my bit, and I'm as you probably remember, and I think afterwards, do you know, nobody came to me and said, "What a good, wow, that's a fantastic word." Nobody came. That's a flipping waste of time. What's all my waste of time? Absolute waste of time. What am I up to? What a flipping waste of time. And God said to me then, look, or sometimes he says to me, look, this is my word. I'll tell you two things. One, was it right for you to share it? Were you certain that it was right to share it? Or did you just want the kind of publicity? Is that right? And the second thing is, he said, anyway, who told you to say it? And if it was me, isn't that enough? You don't need the accolade of people, do you? And if nobody responded, don't worry about it because it's in my hands. You do it for me, not to get an accolade of people saying things to you. So God is kind of saying to me, look, don't expect to have a lovely kind of comment from people. Sometimes it does happen and you're very pleased, but sometimes I've done it and there's no response at all, and you think this is flipping a waste of time, and God said no, it isn't. But no, as I say again, it's either you shouldn't have done it and you're wasting your time to get a bit of an accolade, or you did do it and let God then do the rest. If nobody responds, don't worry, because you don't know what's happening in people's hearts. And the interesting thing is that I think, you see, from my point of view, this is a personal testimony again, that God knows I'm a bit arrogant, and I want to kind of a bit of people coming to me, aren't you a fantastic guy type of thing. And he says to me, what I've done, and in fact, this is what happens, I find that I am a messenger. God gives me something, I share it with someone else, and there's a miracle. And this has happened on a number of occasions. I've heard of something, I know it's valid, I shared it with someone else, and a miracle has happened in 3 or 4 occasions. And I think God's saying to me, yeah, I know you're arrogant. Now, I'm not going to let you have the publicity, but a miracle is going to happen. But all you do is you're just my messenger that has brought this to this, and this happens. Now, it's quite interesting that there is a kind of a dialogue between God and myself, and I've got to learn some lessons. Okay, guys, that's it.